I was sitting in a leather chair across from my cardiologist's desk, waiting for him to pull up my latest echocardiogram results, when I noticed the small silver picture frame angled just slightly toward his side of the room. It was turned enough that most patients probably never gave it a second look. But I have spent 31 years running a furniture company, and if there is one thing 3 decades of studying craftsmanship teaches you, it's how to notice the details other people walk right past. The woman in that photograph was laughing on a white sand beach, wearing a blue sundress I recognized instantly because I had bought it for her myself 2 Christmases ago from a boutique in Charleston. Her hair was down, sun-bleached at the tips, the way it only gets after real time in real sunlight, not the kind you get from a weekend at the lake. She was leaning into whoever was holding the camera with the particular kind of ease you only have around someone you trust completely. The woman in that photograph was my wife. My name is Gordon Whitaker. Everyone who knows me calls me Gordy. I'm 57 years old, and I built Whitaker Custom Furnishings up from a one-man workshop in my father's garage into a company that now supplies handcrafted pieces to hotels and private clients across 11 states, worth somewhere north of $22 million on a good year. I am, by nature and by necessity, a man who pays close attention to small inconsistencies, because in my business, the difference between a joint that holds for 50 years and one that fails in 5 is often something so small most people would never notice it at all. So when I saw my wife, Renee, laughing on a beach I had never taken her to, in a doctor's office where I was the patient and she had no obvious reason to have ever set foot, my mind did what it always does. It started quietly, methodically, working the problem before my heart had even caught up to what my eyes were telling me. "Mr. Whitaker," Dr. Preston Hale said, glancing up from his monitor. He was younger than me by a good 15 years, athletic, the kind of doctor who looks like he takes his own cardiovascular advice seriously. "Your numbers are looking stable. I want to make a small adjustment to your beta blocker dosage, and I'd like to add a low-dose potassium supplement given your latest blood work." "Nothing alarming, just fine-tuning." I nodded along, asked the appropriate questions, thanked him, and walked out of that office with a new prescription in my hand, and a photograph burned into the back of my mind that I could not stop turning over. I want to be honest about something before I go further. Renee is my second wife. My first wife, Carol, passed away from ovarian cancer 14 years ago, when our son, Ben, was just finishing high school. I met Renee 3 years later at a charity gala for the Children's Hospital, and for the first time since Carol's death, I felt something that resembled hope again. We married 11 years ago. I trusted her completely. I built my entire second chapter of life around that trust. That evening, I didn't say anything to Renee about the photograph. Instead, I did what I have always done when a business partner's numbers don't add up. I started quietly gathering information before I confronted anyone with anything. I started with the small things. Renee had been going to a wellness retreat upstate every 6 to 8 weeks for almost a year, always for 2 or 3 nights, always paid for in cash from an account she managed separately for her interior design consulting business. She'd started using a passcode on her phone 8 months ago, something she'd never bothered with in the previous decade of our marriage. She'd taken up an unusually intense interest in her own cardiovascular health lately too, mentioning Dr. Hale's name more than once at dinner, praising how thorough and genuinely caring he was, in a tone that, looking back, had a warmth to it that seemed disproportionate for a man who was, as far as I knew, simply my physician. I called my son Ben that night. Ben is 29, an emergency room nurse at St. Vincent's downtown, sharp as a scalpel and fiercely protective of me since his mother died. I told him what I'd seen. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Dad," he finally said, "I need you to actually think about this before you jump to conclusions. But also, I need you to tell me exactly what medication changes Hale just made." because something about this is bothering me for reasons that have nothing to do with the photograph. I read him the new prescription. Ben went quiet again, longer this time. Dad, you've been on the same beta blocker for 3 years with no issues. Why would he suddenly add a potassium supplement on top of it without ordering more extensive blood work first? That combination at certain doses, especially with your existing heart rhythm history, isn't something a cautious cardiologist just casually tacks on. I want you to hold off filling that prescription until I can look at your actual chart. I didn't understand the medical significance of what Ben was telling me yet, not fully, but I understood enough to feel a cold, unfamiliar dread settle into my chest, sitting right alongside the grief of what I already suspected about that photograph. Ben came by my workshop 2 days later with a folder of printed research and a look on his face I hadn't seen since he was a resident nervously presenting his first case study. He sat across from my workbench, pushed aside a stack of walnut veneer samples, and laid it all out for me. Potassium chloride in the wrong dose, especially combined with a beta blocker that's already slowing your heart rate, can cause a fatal arrhythmia, he said. It's actually one of the components used in lethal injection protocols, Dad, at high enough concentrations. At a slightly elevated but medically explainable dose over time, especially in a man your age with an existing cardiac history, it could gradually push your potassium levels into a dangerous range without triggering obvious alarm bells, right up until it causes a sudden, fatal cardiac event that would look, to any medical examiner, exactly like a natural heart attack in a 57-year-old man with a known heart condition. I sat there in my workshop, surrounded by 30 years of sawdust and craftsmanship, and felt the floor tilt beneath me the way it does right before you understand something you can never unknow. You think Hale is trying to kill me, I said, needing to hear the words out loud before I could believe them. I think, Ben said carefully, that you need to find out exactly what's going on between your wife and your cardiologist before you fill a single pill of that prescription. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I've built an entire career on the principle that you don't accuse a supplier of fraud until you have the invoices in hand to prove it. And I wasn't about to burn down my marriage or risk tipping off whatever was actually happening on the strength of a beach photograph and a nurse's professional suspicion alone. So I called the one person I trusted to help me build that case quietly and correctly. Ray Delgado spent 26 years as a homicide detective before he retired and started a small, private investigation practice on the side, mostly doing corporate due diligence work for companies like mine. We'd known each other for almost 20 years, ever since he furnished his entire lake house with pieces from my workshop, and we struck up a friendship over the shared appreciation of doing careful, methodical work. When I called him and explained what I'd seen and what Ben had told me, he didn't hesitate. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. "Don't confront her. Don't confront him. Fill the prescription if you have to avoid raising suspicion, but do not actually take it. I'll have someone I trust verify the pills independently, just in case anyone gets creative with the actual contents of the bottle versus what's printed on the label." Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I smiled at Renee across the dinner table every night, asked about her design clients, listened to her talk about her upcoming retreat, and felt something inside me quietly hardening into the same cold clarity I've relied on for 31 years of closing difficult business deals. I did not let it show on my face. I've negotiated with contractors who tried to cheat me out of 6 figures without ever once raising my voice, and I called on every ounce of that same discipline now. In the meantime, I found myself replaying the last several years of our marriage with a kind of forensic attention I'd never applied to my own life before. I remembered the trip to Charleston 2 Christmases ago when I bought her that blue sundress, how she'd seemed distracted the whole weekend, checking her phone under the table at dinner. I remembered the sudden interest she'd developed in heart-healthy cooking about a year and a half ago, right around the time Ray later confirmed her affair had begun, and how she'd started buying me specific supplements from a particular pharmacy across town, instead of the one 3 minutes from our house that we'd always used. At the time, I had chalked it up to her being thoughtful, attentive, the kind of wife who researched things for my benefit. Looking back with clearer eyes, every one of those small kindnesses now looked less like love and more like reconnaissance, like a woman quietly gathering the pieces she'd need for something much larger than a dinner recipe. I remembered, too, the night 4 months earlier when she'd suggested, almost offhandedly while we were doing our taxes, that we should simplify our estate planning and consolidate everything into a single updated policy, naming her as sole beneficiary rather than splitting coverage between her and Ben the way we'd originally structured it when we married. I'd agreed without much thought at the time. It seemed like the kind of practical, loving suggestion a devoted spouse makes. I understand now that it was the first domino in a plan that had been carefully falling into place for well over a year before I ever noticed a single thing was wrong. Ray's report came back in 9 days, not 2 weeks. He called and asked to meet me at my workshop after hours, and the moment I saw the thickness of the folder he was carrying, I knew whatever was in it was worse than I'd allowed myself to imagine. "Gordy, I'm going to walk you through this slowly," he said, spreading photographs and printed documents across my workbench. First, the affair. It's real and it's not new. Renee and Dr. Hale have been involved for approximately 14 months. The wellness retreats were booked at a resort in the Bahamas under a corporate rate tied to a medical conference Hale claims to attend annually, except conference records show he hasn't actually presented or registered for that conference in 3 years. They've been meeting there together. And at a lake house Hale owns, under an LLC that isn't in his name on any public record, roughly every 6 weeks, matching Renee's travel pattern exactly. He pulled out a stack of photographs, time-stamped and organized with the same methodical precision I imagine he once brought to a homicide case file. There was Renee and Hale walking hand in hand along a private dock. There was Renee laughing on that same white sand beach. The exact photograph I'd seen turned slightly toward Hale's side of his office desk. There was a photograph of the two of them at a small waterfront restaurant, Hale's hand resting on the small of her back in a way that made my stomach twist, even though I'd already braced myself for exactly this. The LLC that owns the lake house is called Coastal Horizon Holdings, Ray continued. Registered 11 months ago, right around the time your insurance policy was updated. I traced the initial funding for that LLC back to a personal loan Hale took out against his own condo. He's been bleeding money trying to maintain 2 separate lives, Gordy, which tells me the affair alone wasn't going to be enough to fund the future they were apparently planning for themselves. I stared at a photograph of the two of them on that same white sand beach and felt something in my chest I can only describe as grief for a marriage that, apparently, had already been over for over a year without my knowledge. That's the part that hurts, Ray said, his voice softening slightly. This next part is the part that's dangerous. I did some digging into your life insurance policy through a contact who handles underwriting compliance work. Gordy, when did you last update your policy? I told him it had been about 18 months earlier, when Renee had suggested we both increase our coverage for peace of mind, given how the business had grown. Your policy is now worth $12 million, Gordy, with Renee as the sole primary beneficiary. It was increased from $3 million to $12. At Renee's specific request, according to the broker's file notes, roughly 2 months before her relationship with Hale appears to have started. Based on the earliest hotel records I could find, I felt sick. Renee hadn't just been having an affair. She had been planning something long before that photograph on Hale's desk ever caught my eye, restructuring our finances with a patience and precision that, in a strange and horrifying way, reminded me of my own methodical approach to business. There's one more thing, Ray said, sliding a final document across the table. I had a pharmacist I trust independently analyze a sample from your actual prescription bottle, the one your wife picked up for you from the pharmacy last week while you were at the workshop. The potassium supplement inside doesn't match the labeled dosage. It's concentrated at nearly triple the strength printed on the bottle. Someone swapped the capsules, Gordy. Given the beta blocker you're already on, combined with your existing cardiac history, if you'd taken that supplement as prescribed for even another few weeks, Ben's fear would have become a very real, very fatal reality, and it would have looked on paper like nothing more than an unfortunate cardiac event in a man your age. I sat in my workshop for a long time after Ray left that night, surrounded by half-finished dining tables and the smell of fresh-cut oak, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I now understood. My wife of 11 years had fallen in love with, or at the very least entangled herself deeply with, the physician entrusted with my heart. Together, they had engineered a planned patient enough to unfold over more than a year, restructuring my own insurance policy under the guise of loving concern, before finally beginning the slow, deniable process of poisoning me through the one person I trusted completely to keep that heart beating. I did not confront Renee that night or the next. I have spent 3 decades learning that the worst thing you can do when you finally have the full picture of a betrayal is to act on raw emotion before you've secured your position. Instead, I called Ray back the following morning and asked him one question. Can we build a case airtight enough that neither of them walks away from this? And can we do it without me swallowing a single one of those pills? Ray told me it would take patience, precision, and one very carefully staged piece of theater. I told him I had 31 years of experience building things meant to last. I could manage patience. We spent the better part of a week planning every detail before we moved. Ray insisted on bringing in a contact from the district attorney's financial crimes and elder risk unit early, a sharp, quietly relentless prosecutor named Denise Marchetti, who had handled 2 prior cases involving physicians accused of manipulating vulnerable patients for financial gain. Denise made it clear from our first meeting that if we wanted a conviction that would actually stick, and not just a messy, drawn-out he said, she said battle in family court, we needed the recordings to be airtight, the pharmacy tampering documented by an independently verifiable lab, and a controlled moment where both Renee and Hale incriminated themselves in a setting law enforcement could act on immediately. The insurance fraud angle is actually what makes this easier, Denise explained, sitting across from me in Ray's cramped little office above a hardware store downtown. Attempted murder cases built purely on medical suspicion are notoriously hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Juries want to believe doctors, even bad ones. But financial motive, especially one this large, this deliberately concealed through a shell company, gives us an entirely separate and much more prosecutable case that will run in parallel and reinforce the murder charge. We're not just asking a jury to believe your cardiologist tried to hurt you. We're showing them exactly why in dollars and cents and letting the math speak for itself. Over the next 3 weeks, I continued taking the original unaltered beta blocker exactly as prescribed, but quietly disposed of every capsule from the tampered potassium bottle, replacing them with Ben's careful guidance, with harmless placebo capsules matched for size, color, and weight, so that neither Renee nor anyone counting pills would notice the substitution. It was strange, standing in my own bathroom at night, carefully weighing empty gelatin capsules on a small kitchen scale Ben had brought over, filling them with an inert powder, while my wife slept peacefully in the next room, entirely unaware that the man she was slowly trying to kill was at that very moment quietly disassembling her plan one capsule at a time. Ray installed a small, legally compliant recording device in my own home office, where Renee occasionally took calls she thought were private behind a closed door, and coordinated with a contact in the district attorney's financial crimes and elder risk unit. Given the insurance fraud dimension of what we were building, the recordings, once we had them, were almost unbearable to listen to. In one, dated 3 weeks into our surveillance, I heard Renee's voice, low and urgent, speaking to who could only have been Dr. Hale. He hasn't said anything, Preston. I think it's working. His last lab should be showing elevated potassium by now, and nobody's going to think twice about a man his age with his cardiac history having an event. We just need another month, maybe 6 weeks. Hale's voice, tinny through the recording but unmistakable, replied with a chilling clinical detachment. The dosage is calibrated to stay under the threshold that would trigger a follow-up EKG alert in the office system. As long as he keeps taking it as prescribed, we're fine. The policy pays out in full regardless of cause. As long as it's ruled natural and with his history, no examiner is going to look twice at a sudden cardiac event. And after, Renee asked, her voice softening into something that made my stomach turn, we finally get to actually build the life we keep talking about. No more sneaking around, no more excuses. After, Hale said, we take the 12 million, sell the lake house under a different name, and start over somewhere nobody's ever heard of Gordon Whitaker. I sat in Ray's car outside my own house, listening to that recording on a set of headphones, and I felt something in me go completely, permanently still. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives once grief has fully burned away and left only resolve behind it. I had felt it once before, briefly the week after Carol died, when I had to decide whether Ben and I were going to fall apart or rebuild. I felt it again now. I want them both, I told Ray, not just exposed. I want a courtroom agents, and every single dollar of that fraud unwound before either of them ever sees a cent of my money. Ray smiled, the particular smile of a man who has spent 26 years waiting for exactly this kind of clean, well-documented case to fall into his lap. Then let's give them their ending, Gordy. Let's let them think they won, right up until the moment they don't. 2 days later, I told Renee, with as much genuine-sounding exhaustion as I could manage, that I hadn't been feeling well. Some fatigue, some lightheadedness, symptoms Ben had coached me on carefully to mimic mild hyperkalemia without alarming her into backing off the plan. Renee's concern, watching her fuss over me at the kitchen table, brewing me tea, insisting I call Dr. Hale's office first thing in the morning, was so convincing that if I hadn't already heard that recording with my own ears, I might have believed every second of it myself. That is, I understood now exactly the kind of performance she had been giving me for over a year. The following week, I scheduled a follow-up appointment with Dr. Hale, ostensibly to discuss my worsening symptoms. Ben, in full nursing scrubs, accompanied me as my son and, unbeknownst to anyone in that office, as a witness working directly with the district attorney's investigators, who were coordinating the timing of the appointment with a warrant already prepared and waiting. Dr. Hale reviewed my chart with a practiced, sympathetic frown, discussing my concerning reported symptoms, and suggested we run an immediate EKG and blood work given my cardiac history. I sat calmly in the exam chair, letting him believe every second of the performance was landing exactly as planned, while 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit, having already obtained the recorded conversations and the pharmacy tampering evidence from Ray, waited quietly in the hallway outside with local police. Dr. Hale, I said, once the nurse had finished drawing my blood, before we go any further, I'd like to ask you something directly. How long have you been sleeping with my wife? The color drained from his face so completely and so instantly that I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost, Mr. Whitaker. I don't know what I have a recording of you discussing my $12 million life insurance policy with Renee 3 weeks ago, I said, keeping my voice level, the same voice I used to close a difficult contract. I have a pharmacist's independent analysis proving my potassium supplement was tampered with at triple the prescribed strength. And I have every single pill from that original bottle, preserved and labeled, sitting in an evidence bag with my private investigator right now. Dr. Hale's hands began to shake. He stood up so fast, his rolling stool crashed backward into the exam table behind him. and he made it exactly 3 steps toward the door before it opened and 2 investigators stepped through. "Badges already raised. Dr. Preston Hale," the lead investigator said. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and medical malpractice resulting in attempted homicide." Ben stood quietly at my side through all of it, his hand resting steady on my shoulder, and I realized in that moment just how much of my late wife Carol's fierce protectiveness had been passed down into our son. Renee's arrest happened almost simultaneously at our home, where investigators found the original, unaltered prescription bottle she'd been using to refill and re-tamper with my medication every month, hidden inside a jewelry box in her closet alongside a burner phone containing months of text messages with Hale, several of which explicitly discussed the timeline and how much longer he can realistically last before it looks suspicious. I was not there when they arrested her. I couldn't bring myself to watch that particular scene play out in person. Ray told me afterward that she'd sobbed and begged the arresting officers to let her call me, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that she loved me, that whatever they thought they'd found didn't mean what it looked like. I did not take that call then or in the weeks that followed. Some betrayals do not deserve the dignity of a conversation. The case moved through the courts over the following 8 months. Ray's documentation, combined with the pharmacist's tampering analysis, Ben's expert medical testimony about the lethal potential of the altered dosage, and the recorded conversations Ray had legally captured, built a case so thorough that Hale's defense attorney reportedly advised him to take a plea deal within the first 6 weeks rather than risk trial. He pleaded guilty to attempted murder and insurance fraud conspiracy, surrendering his medical license permanently and accepting a sentence of 18 years. The state medical board's disciplinary hearing happened separately and faster than the criminal case. I chose to attend that one in person, sitting quietly in the back row while board members read the tampering report and the recorded conversation into the official record. Hale sat at a table at the front of the room in an ill-fitting suit, his once easy confidence completely gone. And when the board chair announced the permanent revocation of his license, he didn't argue, didn't protest, just stared down at his own hands like a man finally understanding the full scope of what he'd thrown away. Renee fought harder, insisting through 2 different defense attorneys that she'd been manipulated by Hale, that the affair was real, but the murder plot was entirely his idea, that she'd never actually intended to go through with it. The recordings made that defense almost impossible to sustain, particularly the exchange where her own voice could be heard discussing the timeline with a patience that betrayed months, not moments, of deliberate planning. A jury convicted her on conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud after less than 4 hours of deliberation. She's currently serving a 14-year sentence at a state correctional facility, roughly 90 minutes from the house we used to share. I did attend her sentencing hearing, the only part of the entire process I forced myself to sit through in the same room as her. She looked smaller than I remembered, her expensive highlights grown out into a plain, tired brown, and when the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she turned in her seat and looked directly at me for the first time since her arrest. "Gordy, I did love you," she said, her voice cracking. "It just wasn't enough somewhere along the way, and I made a terrible, unforgivable choice instead of just leaving honestly." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to a woman who had chosen, for over a year, to slowly poison the man she claimed to love, rather than simply file for divorce like any honest person would have. Some decisions strip you permanently of the right to be heard, no matter how sincere the apology sounds afterward. I sold that house within a year. I couldn't sit in that kitchen anymore, the one where she'd brewed me tea with such convincing concern the week before her arrest, without feeling something cold crawl up the back of my neck. I bought a smaller place closer to my workshop instead, simpler, quieter, filled almost entirely with furniture I built with my own two hands over the following months. The same slow, careful craft that has always been the one part of my life I could trust completely. Coastal Horizon Holdings, the LLC that had funded Hale and Renee's secret second life, was dissolved by court order 6 months into the case. Its remaining assets, including the lake house itself, seized and liquidated as part of the restitution judgment against both defendants. I never saw that lake house in person, and I never wanted to. Ray sent me one final photograph after the sale closed. The property listing photo from the real estate agent who handled the auction, and I deleted it from my phone without looking at it twice. The insurance company, once the fraud was confirmed and both defendants convicted, formally voided the $12 million policy in its original altered form entirely, citing the criminal conspiracy uncovered during the investigation. Working with my own attorney afterward, I set up an entirely new, modest policy, structured honestly this time, with no one but Ben as any kind of beneficiary, and no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit ever again. It's been nearly 2 years now since that afternoon in Dr. Hale's office, when a photograph turned just slightly toward the wrong angle caught my eye. My heart, ironically, has never been healthier. My real cardiologist now, a gruff, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Alvarez, who Ben personally vetted before I'd let her anywhere near my chart, tells me my numbers look better than men 15 years younger than me. I like to think there's something almost poetic in that. The heart they tried so patiently, so quietly to stop, is still beating steadier than ever. Ben still comes by the workshop most Sunday afternoons. We don't talk about Renee much anymore. What we do talk about is the $12 million insurance policy, now fully restored to its original honest purpose, with Ben listed as the sole beneficiary, a decision I made the week Renee was sentenced and haven't second-guessed for a single day since. I've also started informally training a young apprentice at the workshop, a quiet kid with steady hands and an eye for detail sharp enough to remind me a little of myself at that age. And there's a particular satisfaction in teaching someone the value of paying close attention to the small things, the details other people would simply walk right past, because that's really what saved my life in the end. Not luck, not some dramatic twist of fate. Just the simple, hard-won habit of a man who spent 31 years learning never to ignore the one detail that doesn't quite fit the frame it's sitting in. Never assume the people closest to you are incapable of the coldest kind of patience, and never underestimate what a careful, observant person notices, even in a room they only expected to sit in for 15 quiet minutes. Have you ever caught a small, seemingly harmless detail that ended up unraveling something much larger and much darker in your own life? Tell me your story in the comments below, and if this one kept you hooked until the very end, make sure to like and subscribe for more true story narrations every week.